In the grand halls of Ravenshollow Palace, where centuries of royal bloodline have walked before, Queen Cordelia watches as her husband King Edmund signs the document that will change their kingdom forever. Her tears fall silently onto the marble floor, each drop carrying the weight of 30 years of marriage, sacrifice, and unspoken truths. Tonight, the last thread connecting their hearts will be severed, not by death or scandal, but by a choice that will echo through history. What happens when a queen who has given everything discovers that love, duty, and crown cannot always coexist? Some connections are meant to be eternal, but others must be broken to set the soul free. The palace clock strikes midnight, and with it, everything Cordelia believed about her life, her marriage, and her future begins to unravel. This is not just the end of a royal marriage. This is the beginning of a woman's journey to reclaim herself from the shadows of a crown that was never truly hers to wear. Queen Cordelia stood at the towering window of the Blue Chamber, watching the autumn leaves dance across the palace courtyard. The golden light of late afternoon cast long shadows through the room where she had spent countless hours over the past 30 years. Today felt different. Today felt like an ending. The sound of footsteps echoed through the marble corridors, growing closer with each passing moment. She recognized that particular rhythm, confident, purposeful, carrying the weight of kingship with every step. King Edmund was coming to find her, just as he had done thousands of times before. But this time, she knew, would be the last. Cordelia's fingers traced the delicate pattern of her wedding ring, a circle of platinum and diamonds that had bound her to this life, this palace, this man who had been both her greatest love and her deepest sorrow. The ring felt heavier today, as if the weight of 3 decades had suddenly settled into the precious metal. When the chamber doors opened, she didn't turn around immediately. She could feel Edmund's presence filling the space behind her, the familiar energy that had once made her heart race with excitement and now filled her with a complex mixture of love and resignation. Cordelia, his voice was softer than usual, stripped of the formal tone he used in public. Here, in their private moments, he was still the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the prince who had swept her off her feet at a charity gala, who had promised her a life of purpose and partnership. "I've been expecting you," she replied, finally, turning to face him. Edmund looked older than his 62 years, the crown having taken its toll through sleepless nights and impossible decisions. His once dark hair was now silver at the temples, and lines of worry had etched themselves around his kind blue eyes. He held a leather portfolio in his hands, the same one she had seen him carrying to and from his private study for the past several weeks. Whatever was inside those documents had been consuming him, changing him, pulling him away from her in ways that went beyond physical distance. The council meeting this morning, Edmund began, setting the portfolio on the antique writing desk that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Victoria's sister. "The decision has been made." Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat, though she had known this moment was coming. The signs had been there for months, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the meaningful glances exchanged between Edmund and his closest advisors, the way he had begun looking at her with a sadness that seemed to grow deeper each day. "The succession laws," she said quietly, stating what she already knew to be true. Edmund nodded, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he assumed when delivering difficult news to Parliament or foreign dignitaries. But his voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "The ancient provision has been invoked. After 30 years without an heir, the marriage must be dissolved to preserve the continuity of the crown." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Cordelia had known from the beginning that her inability to bear children would one day become a matter of national importance. She had endured countless medical consultations, experimental treatments, and the constant speculation of the press and public. Each month that passed without an announcement had felt like another small failure, another disappointment not just to herself and Edmund, but to an entire kingdom that looked to them for stability and continuity. "I fought them," Edmund continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "For months, I argued with the council, with Parliament, with anyone who would listen. I told them that we had given everything to this country, that our marriage was about more than producing heirs. I reminded them of all the modernization efforts we've led, the charities we've supported, the diplomatic relationships we've strengthened." Cordelia moved to the velvet armchair where she had spent countless evenings reading state papers and correspondence from their various patronages. The chair felt foreign to her now, as if she no longer belonged in this room, in this life she had built so carefully over 3 decades. But they have the law on their side, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within her. Yes. Edmund's admission came out as barely more than a whisper. The Succession Preservation Act of 1847. If a royal marriage produces no heir within 30 years, it can be dissolved by Act of Parliament to allow the sovereign to remarry and attempt to secure the succession. Cordelia had read that law many times over the years, each reading feeling like a countdown to this inevitable moment. The act had been written during a time when royal marriages were purely political arrangements, when the idea of love between a king and queen was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the foundation of a union. Your cousin James, she said, thinking of Edmund's younger cousin who had always been next in line after any children they might have had. He's married, has children. James is 45 years old with a strong marriage and 2 healthy sons, Edmund confirmed. The council believes that if I were to remarry, there would still be time to secure a direct heir. They've already identified several suitable candidates, princesses and duchesses from allied kingdoms, all young, all proven fertile. The clinical way he described the process made Cordelia's heart ache. This was what royal marriage had always been beneath the surface, a breeding arrangement dressed up in ceremony and romance. She had been naive to think that their genuine love for each other would be enough to overcome centuries of tradition and the cold calculations of statecraft. When? She asked, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. The paperwork will be finalized within the month. The announcement will be made after the Harvest Festival, giving us time to prepare the public and coordinate with our international allies who will need to adjust their diplomatic protocols. Edmund moved closer to where she sat, and, for the first time since he had entered the room, she could see the depth of pain in his eyes. This decision was destroying him as much as it was her. But, unlike her, he still had a duty to fulfill, a crown to wear, a kingdom to serve. Cordelia, you must know that this is not what I want. If I could choose differently, if there were any other way. But there isn't, she interrupted gently. There never was. We both knew that from the beginning, even if we chose not to think about it. She stood up and walked to her private writing desk, where she kept her personal correspondence and journal. Hidden in the bottom drawer, beneath years of letters from family and friends, was a small velvet box. She had put it there 20 years ago and never taken it out, but she had always known that someday she would need it. Inside the box was a gold locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had given up her own noble title to marry for love, only to spend her final years regretting the sacrifice when poverty and social isolation took their toll. When Cordelia had accepted Edmund's proposal, she had tucked the locket away as a reminder of what happened when duty and desire pulled in opposite directions. I've been thinking about what comes next, she said, holding the locket up to catch the light from the window. Where I'll go, what I'll do. I haven't been Cordelia Ashworth for 30 years. I'm not sure I remember how to be anyone other than your queen. Edmund crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her hands in his. His skin was warm and familiar, marked with the same small scar on his knuckle that he had gotten during their honeymoon when he tried to fix a broken shutter at their private cottage in Scotland. You'll always be my queen, he said fiercely. No matter what the law says, no matter who I'm forced to marry, no matter what history writes about this moment. You are the only woman I have ever loved, and that will never change. Cordelia felt the tears she had been holding back all afternoon finally begin to fall. These were not tears of sadness, though grief was certainly part of what she felt. These were tears of release, the profound relief that came with finally acknowledging a truth that had been building for years. I know, she whispered, and I love you too. But love isn't enough anymore, is it? Edmund's own eyes were bright with unshed tears as he brought her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. It should be. In a perfect world, it would be. But we don't live in a perfect world, Cordelia said, gently pulling her hands free. We live in a world where kings must have heirs and queens who cannot provide them must step aside gracefully. She moved back to the window, looking out at the gardens where they had walked together on countless evenings, discussing everything from international policy to their favorite novels. Those gardens would continue to bloom and flourish long after she was gone, tended by gardeners who would eventually forget that she had once walked among those roses and lavender plants. There's something else, Edmund said quietly. Something I need to tell you before the lawyers and diplomats take over this conversation entirely. Cordelia turned back to face him, noting the way his jaw tightened when he was about to reveal something particularly difficult. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, he said. The council has suggested her as the most suitable candidate for marriage. She's 28, from excellent family, has already had 2 children from her previous marriage which ended in widowhood. Cordelia knew Lady Charlotte, had met her at various state functions over the years. She was indeed lovely, intelligent, well-educated, everything a modern queen should be. Most importantly, she was young enough to give Edmund the airs that Cordelia never could. She's a good choice, Cordelia said, and meant it. She'll be kind to the staff, gracious with foreign dignitaries, and she genuinely cares about the charitable causes she supports. I've already spoken with her, Edmund admitted. Informally, of course. She understands the nature of what would be expected, a marriage of duty rather than love. She's agreed to the arrangement. This revelation shouldn't have surprised Cordelia, but it still felt like a physical blow. Of course, the practical arrangements were already in motion. Royal marriages required months of negotiation and planning. The fact that Edmund had already begun those conversations meant that this decision had been made weeks ago, even if he was only telling her today. You'll be happy together, she said, forcing herself to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the betrayal of his secrecy. She has a good heart, and you both understand your duties. Edmund stepped closer again, and she could see the desperate need for forgiveness in his expression. Cordelia, I need you to know that none of this is easy for me. If there were any other way, there isn't, she said firmly. And I wouldn't ask you to choose differently even if there were. The crown is bigger than both of us, bigger than our marriage, bigger than our personal happiness. I've always known that. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting the room in soft purple shadows. Soon, the staff would be lighting the evening lamps and beginning preparations for dinner. In a few hours, they would sit across from each other at the formal dining table, making polite conversation about the day's events as they had done thousands of times before. But tonight would be different. Tonight would be one of their last dinners as husband and wife. What will you do? Edmund asked. Where will you go? Cordelia had been thinking about this question for months, ever since she first sensed the shift in the palace's atmosphere that signaled major changes ahead. I'll return to Ashworth House, at least initially. It's been empty since my father died, and it needs someone to care for it properly. Ashworth House was the estate where she had grown up, a beautiful but modest manor house in the countryside, far from the goldfish bowl of royal life. It had been her sanctuary as a child, the place where she could be simply Cordelia rather than the future queen. After that, she continued, I'm not sure. Perhaps I'll write. I've always wanted to try. Or maybe I'll travel, see some of the places we never had time to visit properly because every trip was a state visit with schedules and protocols. Edmund nodded slowly, but she could see the pain in his expression at the thought of her building a life that didn't include him. The settlement will ensure that you never want for anything. The house in London will remain yours, and there will be a substantial annual allowance. I don't want to discuss money, Cordelia said quietly. Not today. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the life they were about to leave behind. Finally, Edmund spoke again. There will be an official announcement in 2 weeks. After that, everything will move very quickly. The press, the public, the international community, everyone will have opinions about what we're doing and why. Cordelia had been dreading this aspect almost as much as the separation itself. For 30 years, their marriage had been held up as an example of modern royal romance, the love match that proved the monarchy could evolve with the times. Now they would be seen as a failure, a couple who couldn't fulfill their most basic royal duty. I'll handle the interviews carefully, she promised. I won't say anything that could damage the crown or make the transition more difficult. I know you won't, Edmund said. You've never put your own interests before the kingdom's needs. It's one of the things I've always loved most about you. As the sun set completely and the room grew dark, Cordelia realized that this conversation, this moment, marked the end of her old life and the beginning of something entirely new. Tomorrow, she would begin the practical work of untangling 30 years of shared existence. She would pack her personal belongings, arrange for the transfer of her private charities to other patrons, and begin the complicated process of returning to being a private citizen. But tonight, she was still Queen Cordelia, still married to the man she loved, still living in the palace that had been her home for 3 decades. Tonight, she would hold on to this identity for just a few more hours, before stepping into an uncertain future where she would have to discover who she was when stripped of her crown and title. I think, she said softly, I'd like to have dinner in our private sitting room tonight. Just the two of us, like we used to when we were first married. Edmund's smile was the first genuine one she had seen from him in weeks. I would like that very much. As they prepared to leave the blue chamber, Cordelia took one last look around the room where so many important conversations of their marriage had taken place. Tomorrow, it would still be here, but it would no longer be hers. Someone else would stand at these windows, sit in these chairs, make decisions that would shape the kingdom's future. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, she felt something unexpected. A flutter of anticipation for the adventure that lay ahead. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating conversation in the blue chamber, and the palace felt like a completely different world. News of the royal separation had broken 2 days ago, sending shockwaves through the kingdom and beyond. Every newspaper in the country carried the story on their front pages, and international media had descended upon the capital like a swarm of hungry locusts, desperate for any scrap of additional information. Cordelia sat in her private study, surrounded by boxes and packing materials. The systematic dismantling of her life felt surreal. 30 years of accumulated memories, gifts from foreign dignitaries, personal correspondence, and treasured books were being carefully sorted into categories. Items to keep, items to donate, and items that belonged to the crown and would remain at the palace. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, moved quietly around the room, wrapping delicate ornaments in tissue paper with the same careful attention to detail she had brought to every task over the past 15 years. Margaret had been devastated by the news and had immediately volunteered to help Cordelia transition to her new life, even though it meant leaving her position at the palace. "Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, holding up a small silver frame containing a photograph of Cordelia and Edmund from their 10th wedding anniversary. In the picture, they were laughing at something just outside the camera's view, their faces radiant with happiness and the confidence that comes from believing your love can overcome any obstacle. Cordelia took the frame and studied the faces of her younger selves. The woman in the photograph looked so certain of her future, so unaware of the heartbreak that would come 2 decades later. "I think this one should go to storage," she said finally. "Perhaps someday I'll want to remember those times, but not yet." The sound of a gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see another staff member with questions about the packing process. Instead, Lady Charlotte Pemberton stepped into the room, looking elegant but nervous in a navy blue dress that was both fashionable and appropriately modest. Cordelia's breath caught in her throat. This was the first time she had seen her replacement since the announcement, and the reality of the situation hit her with fresh force. "Your Majesty," Charlotte said, dropping into a perfect curtsy. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I asked His Majesty if I might speak with you privately, and he suggested this might be a good time." Cordelia gestured to one of the leather armchairs by the window. "Please sit down. Margaret, would you mind giving us some privacy?" Margaret nodded and quietly left the room, though not before giving Charlotte a look that could have frozen summer roses. The palace staff had been uniformly loyal to Cordelia throughout this transition, and their barely concealed resentment toward her replacement had been one of the few sources of comfort during these difficult weeks. "Thank you for seeing me," Charlotte began once they were alone. "I know this must be incredibly difficult for you, and the last thing you probably want is to have a conversation with me." Cordelia studied the younger woman carefully. Charlotte was indeed beautiful, with the kind of classical features that photographed well and would represent the kingdom gracefully on state occasions. But more than that, she seemed genuinely kind. There was no smugness in her demeanor, no triumph at having captured a king. If anything, she appeared almost as uncomfortable with the situation as Cordelia herself. "Please, call me Cordelia," she said. "I think under the circumstances, we can dispense with the formal titles. What did you want to discuss?" Charlotte's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "I wanted you to know that I understand the nature of what I'm agreeing to. This isn't some romantic fantasy for me. I know that His Majesty loves you and always will. I'm not trying to replace what you two have shared." The honesty of the statement was both refreshing and painful. Cordelia had expected to dislike this woman, had prepared herself to find reasons to resent her. Instead, she found herself appreciating Charlotte's directness and lack of pretense. "Then why agree to it?" Cordelia asked. "You're young, beautiful, accomplished. Surely you could find happiness in a marriage based on love rather than duty." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the gardens where Cordelia had walked with Edmund just yesterday, their last private stroll as husband and wife. My first marriage was for love, she said finally. David and I were completely devoted to each other, and when he was killed in that car accident 3 years ago, I thought my heart would never recover. Cordelia remembered the tragedy. Lord David Pemberton had been a promising young diplomat, and his sudden death had shocked society. She had attended the funeral with Edmund, and she recalled being moved by Charlotte's quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming grief. "I'm sorry," Cordelia said gently. "I remember what a difficult time that was for you." "The thing is," Charlotte continued, "I've had my great love story. I know what it feels like to love someone so completely that you can't imagine life without them. And I know what it feels like to lose that person and discover that you can survive, even when you don't want to." She turned to meet Cordelia's eyes directly. "What I can offer His Majesty isn't passion or romantic love. It's partnership, respect, and the ability to do the job that comes with being queen. I understand duty because I've had to rebuild my entire life around it after losing David." Cordelia felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this young woman who had already experienced such profound loss. There was a strength in Charlotte that reminded her of her own younger self, the determination to find purpose and meaning even when life took unexpected turns. "And you believe you can be happy in such a marriage?" Cordelia asked. Charlotte considered the question seriously. "I think I can be content. Edmund is a good man, anyone can see that. He's kind, intelligent, and completely devoted to his responsibilities. We share similar values and interests, and I genuinely respect him. That's a foundation that many successful royal marriages have been built on." "The children," Cordelia said quietly. "That's really what this is all about." "Yes," Charlotte acknowledged without flinching. "I know my primary duty will be to provide heirs for the crown." It sounds cold when stated so directly, but I'm not naive about what's expected. My children with David showed me that I'm capable of having a healthy pregnancy and raising strong, intelligent offspring. The clinical way Charlotte discussed childbearing reminded Cordelia of the countless medical consultations she had endured over the years, the endless testing and procedures that had ultimately revealed no clear reason why she couldn't conceive. The doctors had used words like unexplained infertility and idiopathic subfertility, medical terms that somehow made her body's failure feel even more personal and mysterious. "I want you to know," Cordelia said carefully, "that Edmund will be a wonderful father. I've watched him with his nephews and the children we meet during our public engagements, and he has such natural patience and warmth with young people." Charlotte smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked genuinely happy. "That's one of the things that made this decision easier for me. I know he'll love whatever children we have, even if he can't love me the way he loves you." The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was Edmund himself, looking somewhat anxious as he peered into the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said carefully. "Charlotte, you said you would only need a few minutes." "Actually," Cordelia said, standing up, "I think Lady Charlotte and I have had a very productive conversation. Please, both of you sit down. There are some things I'd like to say to you both." Edmund looked surprised but took the chair next to Charlotte's, carefully maintaining a respectful distance. Cordelia noticed that he seemed uncomfortable with any physical proximity to his future wife, even something as innocent as sitting in adjacent chairs. It was clear that he was still struggling to accept the reality of his situation. "I want you both to know," Cordelia began, "that you have my support and my blessing for this marriage. Not that you need it from a legal standpoint, but I hope it might make the transition easier for both of you." Edmund's eyes widened in surprise. "Cordelia, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted gently. "Edmund, you are going to be a husband again, and Charlotte is going to be queen. You both deserve to start this new relationship without the burden of guilt or resentment from me." She moved to her desk and picked up an envelope that she had been working on for several days. "Charlotte, this contains some notes about palace protocol, relationships with key staff members, and observations about the various charitable organizations that will come under your patronage. It's not comprehensive. You'll learn most of what you need to know through experience, but it might help you avoid some of the mistakes I made in my early years." Charlotte accepted the envelope with obvious emotion. "Thank you. This means more to me than you could know." "And, Edmund," Cordelia continued, turning to her soon-to-be former husband, "I want you to promise me that you'll give this marriage your full effort. Charlotte deserves a husband who is present and engaged, not someone who is constantly looking backward at what he's lost." Edmund's jaw tightened with emotion. "Cordelia, I don't know if I can." "You can," she said firmly. You can because you're a good man and a responsible king, and because Charlotte is a remarkable woman who deserves to be valued for who she is rather than measured against someone else's memory. She sat back down and looked at both of them seriously. I'm going to say something that might surprise you both. I think this marriage could actually be very good for both of you, if you let it be. Edmund, you've spent 30 years trying to balance your personal desires with your royal duties. With Charlotte, those two things can be aligned. She understands the job and wants to do it well. And, Charlotte, you've been a widow for 3 years, focused entirely on raising your children and managing your grief. A partnership with someone who shares your sense of duty might give you a different kind of happiness than you had with David, but it could still be meaningful and fulfilling. The room fell silent as both Edmund and Charlotte absorbed her words. Finally, Charlotte spoke. May I ask you something, Cordelia? How do you find the strength to be so gracious about this? If our positions were reversed, I'm not sure I could be half as generous. Cordelia considered the question. Over the past few weeks, she had asked herself the same thing many times. Where did this unexpected sense of peace come from? Why wasn't she raging against the unfairness of her situation? I think, she said slowly, it's because I finally understand that this isn't a tragedy. It's just a different kind of story than the one I thought I was living. For 30 years, I believed that my value as a queen was tied to my ability to produce heirs. Every month that passed without a pregnancy felt like a personal failure. Another way, I was letting down Edmund and the kingdom. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where staff members were going about their daily routines, largely oblivious to the momentous conversation taking place in this room. But these past few weeks have made me realize that I've been so focused on what I couldn't do that I never fully appreciated what I did accomplish. I helped modernize dozens of charitable organizations, supported educational initiatives that have changed thousands of lives, and represented our kingdom with dignity on hundreds of state visits. I was a good queen, even if I wasn't the queen the succession laws required. She turned back to face them. And now I get to find out who Cordelia is when she's not defined by her relationship to the crown. That's not a punishment, that's an opportunity. Edmund had tears in his eyes as he listened to her words. You were always enough, he said quietly. I hope you know that. You were always more than enough. I know, Cordelia said gently. But enough wasn't what the situation required. It required someone who could secure the succession, and that someone is Charlotte. Charlotte had been listening intently to this exchange, and now she spoke with careful deliberation. Cordelia, I hope you won't disappear entirely from our lives. I know the situation is complicated, but I would value your friendship and guidance if you're willing to offer it. Cordelia felt a genuine smile cross her face for the first time in weeks. I would like that very much. Though I suspect once you're properly settled into royal life, you'll discover you need advice far less than you think you do. Edmund stood up and crossed the room to where Cordelia was standing. There's something I need to say to you before we go any further with this transition. He took her hands in his, just as he had done in the Blue Chamber 3 weeks ago, but this time his touch felt different, less desperate, more accepting. Cordelia, you have been the finest queen this kingdom has ever known. You've brought grace, intelligence, and compassion to every aspect of your role, and you've made me a better king through your partnership and support. Whatever happens next, whatever the history books say about our marriage or this decision, I want you to know that I am grateful for every day we've had together. Cordelia felt fresh tears threatening, but these were different from the tears she had shed 3 weeks ago. These tears were born of gratitude rather than grief, acceptance rather than anger. And I want you to know, she replied, that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Not being your queen, that was just a job, however important. But being loved by you, and loving you in return, has taught me what it means to be fully alive. Charlotte had tears running down her cheeks as she witnessed this final declaration of love between the couple whose marriage was ending to make room for her own future. Rather than feeling like an intruder, she felt honored to be present for such a moment of profound grace and mutual respect. I promise you both, Charlotte said softly, that I will do everything in my power to be worthy of what you're sacrificing for the crown. And, Edmund, I promise that I will never expect you to pretend that what we're building together diminishes what you shared with Cordelia. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Cordelia's study, the three of them sat together in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts about the future that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring more lawyers, more protocols, more public statements, and carefully managed media appearances. But today, In this quiet room surrounded by the remnants of one life and the possibilities of another, they had found something unexpected, not happiness, perhaps, but a kind of peace with the choices they were all making. Cordelia looked around at the half-packed boxes and felt, for the first time since this process began, genuinely excited about what came next. Her old life was ending, but a new adventure was just beginning. 2 months had passed since Cordelia left the palace, and Ashworth House felt like both a sanctuary and a prison. The sprawling Tudor manor where she had grown up now echoed with emptiness, its 37 rooms far too large for one woman and her small household staff. But after 30 years of living under constant public scrutiny, the solitude was also a relief she hadn't expected. She stood in the morning room, reading the latest newspaper coverage of the royal wedding preparations. The headlines were respectful but relentless. Future Queen Charlotte's charity gala raises record funds. King Edmund and Lady Charlotte attend state dinner together. Palace announces royal wedding date, June 15th. Every article included at least one mention of her, the beloved former queen who stepped aside gracefully for the good of the kingdom. The narrative that had emerged in the press painted her as a tragic but noble figure, a woman who had sacrificed her personal happiness for duty. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it also wasn't the complete truth. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting the newspaper aside. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, entered carrying a tea tray and wearing the concerned expression that had become her default look since Cordelia's arrival at Ashworth House. Mrs. Davies had worked for the Ashworth family for 40 years and had watched Cordelia transform from a spirited young girl into a proper princess and then into a queen. Now she was witnessing another transformation, though none of them were quite sure what Cordelia was becoming. "Your Majesty, Mrs. Davies said, using the title that Cordelia had asked her staff to abandon but which they stubbornly maintained. "You have a visitor." Cordelia looked up in surprise. She had been very specific with her secretary about not accepting any social calls during this transition period. The constant stream of well-meaning friends and distant relatives offering comfort and advice had become exhausting. "I specifically asked not to be disturbed today," she said gently. "Who is it?" Mrs. Davies looked uncomfortable. "It's Professor James Whitfield from Cambridge University, Your Majesty. He says you corresponded with him several years ago about historical research, and he has a proposition that might interest you." Cordelia remembered Professor Whitfield vaguely, a distinguished historian who had written to her about a project documenting the role of royal women in educational reform. She had been too busy with official duties to pursue the correspondence at the time, but she had been impressed by his scholarship and thoughtful approach to royal history. "Please show him to the library," she said. "And Mrs. Davies, please ask him to call me Ms. Ashworth. I'm no longer Your Majesty to anyone." Mrs. Davies looked pained, but nodded. "Of course, ma'am." 10 minutes later, Cordelia entered the library to find a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s examining the extensive collection of historical biographies that lined the walls. He turned when she entered, and she was struck by the intelligence and kindness in his gray eyes. "Ms. Ashworth," he said, offering a slight bow. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I hope you'll forgive the presumption, but I felt this couldn't wait for a formal appointment." Cordelia gestured to the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace. "Please sit down. You mentioned a proposition?" Professor Whitfield settled into the chair across from her and pulled a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "I've been following the recent developments with great interest, not from a gossip perspective, but from a historical one. What you've done, the way you've handled this transition, represents something quite remarkable in the annals of royal history." Cordelia felt herself tense slightly. The last thing she wanted was to become a case study in royal martyrdom. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Throughout history, Professor Whitfield continued, royal marriages have ended for many reasons: death, scandal, political necessity. But I can find no precedent for a queen voluntarily stepping aside with such grace while maintaining the dignity of the crown and the respect of the public. You've essentially written a new chapter in constitutional monarchy. He opened his portfolio and spread several documents across the small table between them. "Which brings me to my proposition. Cambridge University Press has approached me about writing a comprehensive history of royal marriage and succession in modern European monarchies. It's a massive undertaking, perhaps 5 years of research and writing." Cordelia leaned forward to examine the documents. She could see charts, timelines, and what appeared to be preliminary chapter outlines. It sounds fascinating, but I'm not sure how I could help. I'm hardly an objective observer of royal marriage. Professor Whitfield smiled. That's exactly why your perspective would be invaluable. This isn't intended to be a gossipy tell-all book. I want to create a serious academic work that examines how royal marriages have evolved to meet changing social expectations while preserving constitutional stability. He pulled out a thick manuscript. I've been working on this for 3 years, but I've reached a point where I need someone with insider knowledge to help me understand the human dynamics behind the constitutional frameworks. Your recent experience, combined with your obviously deep understanding of royal protocol and history, makes you uniquely qualified to serve as a research collaborator. The idea intrigued Cordelia more than she had expected. For 30 years, she had lived through the daily realities of modern monarchy, but she had never had the opportunity to step back and analyze those experiences from an academic perspective. The emotional distance that had been so painful in recent months might actually be an advantage in scholarly work. What exactly would this collaboration involve, she asked. Primarily, I would need someone to help me understand the unwritten rules of royal life, the pressures, expectations, and decision-making processes that don't appear in any official records. You would review my chapters for accuracy and insight, help me understand the context behind public events, and potentially contribute some original writing about your own experiences. Professor Whitfield paused and looked at her seriously. I should mention that this would be published work, with your name as co-author if you chose. It would mean stepping back into public view, though in a very different capacity. Cordelia stood up and walked to the tall windows that looked out over the Ashworth estate gardens. The autumn colors were spectacular this year, and she had been spending hours each day walking the familiar paths, trying to rediscover who she was when stripped of her royal identity. Professor Whitfield, she said without turning around, may I ask you something personal? Do you believe it's possible for someone to reinvent themselves completely at the age of 52? I think, he replied carefully, that the most interesting people are constantly evolving throughout their lives. The question isn't whether reinvention is possible, it's whether you have the courage to embrace the uncertainty that comes with change. She turned to face him. I've spent my entire adult life knowing exactly what was expected of me every day. I knew what to wear, what to say, where to stand, how to respond to any given situation. The predictability was sometimes stifling, but it was also comforting. And now I wake up each morning with no external obligations, no pressing duties, no clear sense of purpose. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. She returned to her chair. Your project would give me something meaningful to work toward again. Professor Whitfield leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. There's something else I should mention. The university has agreed to establish a research fellowship in your name if you join this project, the Cordelia Ashworth Fellowship for Constitutional History. It would fund graduate students studying the evolution of European monarchy for decades to come. The idea of having a lasting academic legacy separate from her royal service was unexpectedly appealing. Cordelia had always been interested in history and had often wished she could have pursued university studies before her marriage. This would be her chance to contribute to scholarship rather than simply living it. I'd like to see more of your existing research before making a decision, she said. And I want to understand exactly what my role would be in the writing and research process. Of course. Professor Whitfield began gathering his papers. Would you be willing to come to Cambridge for a day? I could show you our research facilities, introduce you to some of the other historians working on related projects, and give you a better sense of what the collaboration would involve. Cordelia felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. She hadn't been to Cambridge since a brief official visit early in her reign, and the idea of walking through those historic halls as a potential scholar rather than a royal visitor appealed to her enormously. I think I would like that very much, she said. When would be convenient? How about next week? I could arrange for you to attend a seminar on constitutional history, and afterward we could discuss the specifics of our potential collaboration. After Professor Whitfield left, Cordelia found herself energized in a way she hadn't felt since leaving the palace. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, pulling books about royal history from the shelves and reading with the focused intensity she had once brought to state papers and diplomatic briefings. That evening, as she sat by the fire with a biography of Queen Victoria, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Edmund's private number, the first time he had called since she left the palace. Hello, Edmund, she said, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Cordelia. His voice was warm but tired. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. I wanted to check on how you're settling in. Well, she replied honestly. Ashworth House is peaceful, and I'm beginning to establish some new routines. How are the wedding preparations progressing? Efficiently, Edmund said with a slight chuckle. Charlotte is remarkably organized, and she has very clear ideas about what she wants. It's quite different from planning our wedding, where we were both so overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything. Cordelia remembered their own wedding preparations, the endless meetings with protocol officers, the diplomatic considerations that affected every detail from the guest list to the music selections. She and Edmund had felt like passengers on a ship they couldn't control, swept along by centuries of tradition and constitutional requirements. I'm glad it's going smoothly, she said. Charlotte strikes me as someone who handles stress very gracefully. She does, Edmund agreed. Cordelia, there's something I wanted to tell you. Charlotte suggested that we include a moment of acknowledgement for you in the ceremony. Not anything that would overshadow the day, but a recognition of your service to the crown. I wanted to ask your permission before proceeding. The gesture was thoughtful and typically gracious of Charlotte, but Cordelia found herself declining without hesitation. That's very kind of her, but I think it would be inappropriate. This day should be about your future together, not about the past. I'd prefer not to be mentioned. Are you certain? It would be a way to honor what you've given to the kingdom. I'm certain, Cordelia said firmly. My service speaks for itself, and this wedding should mark the beginning of a new era, not dwell on the end of the old one. They talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, the final details of the financial settlement, the transfer of her remaining charitable patronages, the logistics of maintaining appropriate, but minimal contact after his remarriage. The conversation was cordial but businesslike, lacking the intimate warmth that had characterized their personal discussions for 3 decades. After hanging up, Cordelia realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since their separation, she had spoken to Edmund without feeling the sharp pang of loss that had characterized every previous interaction. Instead, she felt a kind of fond detachment, as if she were speaking to a dear friend from long ago rather than the love of her life. The next morning brought a phone call from Margaret, her former lady-in-waiting, who had taken a position with a charitable foundation in London. Cordelia, Margaret said, her voice bubbling with excitement, I have wonderful news. The International Literacy Foundation has approached me about offering you a consulting position. They want someone with your experience to help them expand their programs in developing nations. Cordelia set down her coffee cup with interest. Tell me more. It would involve traveling to countries where they're establishing new educational programs, working with local officials and international donors to ensure the projects are culturally appropriate and sustainable. The position would be part-time, allowing you flexibility for other projects, but it would use all of your diplomatic experience and your passion for education. The opportunity sounded perfect, meaningful work that would allow her to use her skills while maintaining her independence. Combined with the potential Cambridge project, she was beginning to see the outlines of a new life that might be as fulfilling as her royal career had been, though in completely different ways. I'm very interested, Cordelia told Margaret. Could you arrange a meeting with their leadership team? Already done, Margaret replied with satisfaction. They're coming to London next week and would love to meet with you. Cordelia, I have to tell you, you sound different. Stronger somehow. Cordelia considered Margaret's observation as she hung up the phone. She did feel different, though she hadn't been able to articulate the change until now. For 30 years, her identity had been entirely external, defined by her relationship to Edmund and her role as queen. Every decision had been filtered through the question of how it would affect the crown, the kingdom, and her marriage. Now, for the first time since she was 22 years old, she was making decisions based purely on what interested her and what felt right for her own future. It was both terrifying and exhilarating to discover that she had preferences and ambitions that existed independently of her royal duties. That afternoon, she called Professor Whitfield to accept his invitation to visit Cambridge. As she hung up the phone, she caught sight of herself in the antique mirror above the fireplace. The woman looking back at her had the same face she had worn for 52 years, but there was something new in her expression, a spark of anticipation that had been missing for longer than she cared to admit. For the first time since leaving the palace, Cordelia found herself genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. 6 months had passed since Cordelia's new life began, and she barely recognized herself. As she sat in her study at Cambridge University, surrounded by historical manuscripts and research notes, she felt a contentment that surprised her with its depth. The woman who had once worried about every public appearance and diplomatic nuance was now completely absorbed in 16th-century marriage contracts and constitutional precedents. Her collaboration with Professor Whitfield had evolved beyond either of their initial expectations. What had begun as a consultation had become a true academic partnership, with Cordelia contributing not just royal insights, but serious historical analysis. Her first scholarly article, The Personal as Political, Royal Marriage and Constitutional Stability in Modern Europe, had been accepted by the prestigious Journal of Constitutional History. The university had provided her with a small but elegant office in the history department, and she had discovered the peculiar joy of having colleagues who valued her mind rather than her title. Students and faculty members alike treated her with respect, but it was the kind of respect earned through intellectual contribution rather than inherited through birth or marriage. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts about medieval succession laws. "Come in," she called, looking up from the manuscript she was reviewing. Dr. Sarah Chun, a brilliant young historian specializing in gender and monarchy, peered around the door. "Cordelia, I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial. I wanted to share some exciting news about our research project." Cordelia had developed a genuine fondness for Sarah, whose irreverent sense of humor and fierce intelligence had made their collaboration on women's roles in constitutional monarchy both productive and enjoyable. Unlike many of her new colleagues, Sarah had never seemed awed by Cordelia's royal background. If anything, she treated the former queen's insider knowledge as merely one useful resource among many. "Please, sit down," Cordelia said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What's the news?" Sarah's eyes were bright with excitement. "The European History Association has accepted our proposal for a panel discussion at their annual conference. They want us to present our findings about how royal women have influenced constitutional development across different monarchies." Cordelia felt a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. While she had grown comfortable with academic writing, the idea of presenting her research to a room full of distinguished historians still intimidated her. "When and where?" "Vienna, next spring. The conference theme is Power and Legitimacy in Modern Europe, which is perfect for our work." Sarah paused and studied Cordelia's expression. "You look terrified. This is good news, you know." "I know it is," Cordelia said with a self-deprecating laugh. "It's just that I spent 30 years giving speeches where every word was carefully vetted by teams of advisors. The idea of standing up in front of academics and defending original research feels much more daunting than addressing the United Nations General Assembly." "That's because it matters to you in a different way," Sarah observed perceptively. "When you were giving royal speeches, you were representing the crown. Now you're representing yourself and your own work." The observation was insightful and uncomfortable in its accuracy. Cordelia's academic work had become deeply personal in a way that her royal duties never had been. Every research conclusion, every written analysis, every interpretive argument came from her own mind and experience rather than from briefing papers prepared by others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, who had become her closest link to news from her former life. The message was brief. "Wedding photos are beautiful. Charlotte looks radiant. Thought you should know all went perfectly." Cordelia stared at the message for a moment, trying to identify what she felt about Edmund's marriage, which had taken place 3 days ago. To her surprise, the dominant emotion was relief rather than sadness. The transition was finally complete. He had moved on, and she was free to do the same without any lingering sense of guilt or obligation. "Everything all right?" Sarah asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes," Cordelia said, putting her phone away. "Just some news from my previous life. Good news, actually." She had told her Cambridge colleagues the basic facts of her situation, but she rarely discussed the personal details. They knew she was the former queen who had stepped down to allow the king to remarry, but she had been careful to establish her academic identity as separate from her royal past. It helped that most historians were more interested in queens who had been dead for centuries than in recent royal developments. "Speaking of your previous life," Sarah said carefully, "I wanted to ask your opinion about something. Professor Whitfield and I have been discussing whether to include a chapter about your own experience in our final book manuscript. Not anything invasive or sensational, but an analysis of how your situation fits into the broader patterns we've been studying." The idea made Cordelia deeply uncomfortable. She had found peace with her decision partly because she had been able to frame it as a historical rather than personal event. The thought of having her marriage and separation analyzed alongside centuries of other royal marriages felt like a violation of something sacred. I prefer not to be included, she said firmly. Too recent, too personal, and I'm too close to it to provide objective analysis. Sarah nodded understanding. I thought you might feel that way, but I wanted to ask. The academic perspective would be valuable, but your comfort and privacy are more important. That afternoon, Cordelia had lunch with Professor Whitfield at their favorite pub near the university. Over fish and chips, they discussed their progress on the book manuscript, which was nearing completion after 18 months of intensive work. I have something to tell you, Professor Whitfield said as they finished their meal. The university has approached me about the possibility of offering you a permanent position, a senior research fellowship with the option to teach graduate seminars if you're interested. Cordelia nearly choked on her tea. A permanent position? James, I don't even have a university degree, let alone the credentials for an academic appointment. You have something better, he replied. You have original insights based on unique experience, combined with a natural analytical mind and exceptional writing skills. Your work over the past year has been at the level of someone with decades of academic training. The offer was flattering, but overwhelming. Accepting a permanent academic position would mean fully committing to this new identity, closing the door definitively on any possibility of returning to royal life. Not that such a return was likely or even desirable, but the symbolic significance felt enormous. I'd need to think about it, she said carefully. It's a generous offer, but it represents such a fundamental change from anything I ever imagined for my life. Of course, take all the time you need. But, Cordelia, I hope you'll seriously consider it. You found something here that clearly fulfills you. Don't let fear of change prevent you from embracing what you've built. That evening, Cordelia walked alone through the Cambridge streets, thinking about Professor Whitfield's words. The medieval architecture and cobblestone paths felt like a perfect metaphor for her journey. Ancient foundations supporting something entirely new. She stopped at a small bookshop and was surprised to see her academic article displayed in the window alongside other recent publications. Seeing her name, Dr. Cordelia Ashworth, in print as the author of serious scholarly work, gave her a thrill that was completely different from any satisfaction she had felt during her royal years. Back at her small Cambridge flat, she called her mother, who had been following her transformation with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Darling, her mother said after they had exchanged pleasantries, I have to confess something. When you first told me about this academic work, I thought it was just a phase, something to keep you occupied while you figured out what to do with the rest of your life. Cordelia laughed. And now? Now I think you found your true calling. I haven't heard you sound this intellectually engaged since you were a young girl asking endless questions about everything. Marriage to Edmund was wonderful for you, and you were a magnificent queen, but I don't think it ever challenged you the way this work does. The observation was startling in its accuracy. Cordelia had loved Edmund deeply and had taken great satisfaction in her royal duties, but she had never felt the kind of intellectual excitement that came from grappling with complex historical questions and developing original theories about constitutional development. The university has offered me a permanent fellowship, she told her mother. Are you going to accept? I think I am, Cordelia said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I think I'm going to become an academic. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Your father would be so proud, she said finally. He always believed that the best life was one dedicated to learning and teaching. He would have loved seeing you discover that for yourself. After the phone call, Cordelia sat in her comfortable armchair with a cup of tea and the latest draft of her research. Outside her window, she could see students walking to the library for evening study sessions, and she felt a profound sense of belonging to this community of scholars and learners. Her phone rang again, this time an international number that she recognized as belonging to the Literacy Foundation, where she had been consulting for the past 4 months. The director, Maria Santos, was calling from Guatemala, where they were establishing a new program. Cordelia, Maria's voice was excited despite the poor connection. The project here has exceeded all our expectations. The local government wants to expand the program to 3 additional provinces, and they specifically requested that you lead the implementation team. The offer was tempting, 6 months in Guatemala working directly with educators and community leaders to establish sustainable literacy programs. It would combine her diplomatic experience with her growing expertise in educational policy, and it would be deeply meaningful work. It would mean taking a sabbatical from Cambridge, she said, thinking out loud. We could structure it as a research sabbatical, Maria suggested. You could gather data for your academic work while leading the implementation project. The foundation would support any scholarly publications that emerged from the experience. The idea of spending 6 months in Guatemala, immersed in the practical challenges of international development work, appealed to her enormously. It would be completely different from anything she had done before, more hands-on than her academic research, more focused than her royal charity work. Let me think about it, she said. Can I give you an answer by the end of the week? After hanging up, Cordelia realized she was facing the same type of decision that had defined her entire adult life, a choice between security and adventure, between the familiar and the unknown. But, this time, the choice was entirely hers to make, based purely on what she wanted to do rather than what duty required. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Professor Whitfield, outlining the Guatemala opportunity and asking his advice about how to structure a research sabbatical that would serve both academic and practical purposes. As she wrote, she felt the same sense of excitement that had sustained her through the most challenging moments of her royal years. The difference was that this excitement belonged entirely to her. Whatever decision she made about Guatemala, about the permanent fellowship, about the future direction of her work, would be based on her own assessment of what would be most fulfilling and meaningful. For someone who had spent 30 years serving others' needs and expectations, the freedom to choose her own path felt like the greatest gift she had ever received. And, for the first time since leaving the palace, she was certain that the best parts of her story were still ahead of her. 2 years later, Cordelia stood on the terrace of the University of Guatemala's main campus, watching the sun set over the volcanic mountains that surrounded the city. In her hands was the advanced copy of her book, Crowns and Constitutions, The Evolution of Royal Marriage in Modern Europe, which would be published next month by Cambridge University Press. The dedication read simply, "To those who dare to rewrite their own stories." Her sabbatical in Guatemala had stretched from 6 months to a full year, during which she had helped establish literacy programs in 12 rural provinces while conducting field research for what had become her second academic book. The experience had transformed her understanding of both education and international development, and had led to her current position as director of Cambridge University's new Center for Constitutional and Educational Studies. A gentle knock at her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting the book carefully on her desk. Dr. Elena Vasquez, her research associate and closest friend in Guatemala, entered carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Elena was a brilliant linguist who had become both colleague and confidant during Cordelia's extended stay in the country. "I thought we should celebrate properly," Elena said with a warm smile. "It's not every day that one of our collaborators publishes a book that's already being called groundbreaking by reviewers." Cordelia accepted a glass of champagne with gratitude. The past 2 years had taught her to appreciate celebrations, both large and small. During her royal years, significant achievements had been marked by state ceremonies and formal dinners. Now she found much more satisfaction in quiet moments of acknowledgement with people who had become genuinely important to her. "I still can't quite believe it's real," Cordelia admitted, picking up the book again. "For someone who never attended university, seeing my name on an academic publication feels surreal." "You've earned it through hard work and brilliant insights," Elena said firmly. "That matters more than formal credentials. Besides, the university is rectifying the degree situation. Your honorary doctorate will be awarded at next month's ceremony." The honorary doctorate had been Professor Whitfield's idea, supported enthusiastically by the history department. It would recognize both her scholarly contributions and her innovative approach to combining academic research with practical international development work. The ceremony would mark her official transition from royal refugee to respected academic. "There's something else I want to discuss," Elena continued, settling into the comfortable chair across from Cordelia's desk. "Maria Santos called this morning with an interesting proposal." Maria, who had become a close friend and frequent collaborator, now headed the International Education Consortium, a coalition of universities and development organizations working on global literacy initiatives. The consortium is establishing a new research institute focused on education in post-conflict societies, Elena explained. They want someone to direct it who has both academic credentials and practical experience working with international partners. Your name was the first one suggested. Cordelia felt the familiar flutter of excitement that came with new professional opportunities. The position would build on everything she had learned over the past 2 years while offering the chance to work on some of the most challenging educational problems in the world. Where would it be based? She asked. Geneva, with extensive travel required. The initial funding is for 5 years, with the possibility of extension. It would mean leaving Cambridge, but you'd maintain your research affiliations and could continue your academic work. The prospect was both thrilling and daunting. Geneva would put her back in the world of international diplomacy, though from a completely different perspective than her royal years. Instead of representing one kingdom's interests, she would be working to serve global educational needs. I'd like to hear more details, Cordelia said carefully. But, Elena, I need to ask you something personal. Would you consider joining me if I accepted? I've come to rely on your expertise and perspective more than I think you realize. Elena's face brightened with surprise and pleasure. Are you serious? You'd want me as your deputy director? I'd want you as my partner, Cordelia corrected. This kind of work is too important and too complex for one person to manage alone. Besides, our collaboration here has been one of the most professionally satisfying experiences of my life. That evening, Cordelia walked through the streets of Guatemala City one last time before returning to Cambridge. Her year in Guatemala had been revelatory in ways she was still processing. Working directly with teachers, parents, and community leaders had given her insights into the practical challenges of education that no amount of academic research could have provided. More personally, the experience had completed her transformation from queen to scholar to something that defied easy categorization. She was no longer trying to define herself in opposition to her royal past or in imitation of traditional academic models. She had become something new, a hybrid of diplomat, scholar, and development practitioner who brought unique perspectives to each role. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret, who had become her informal correspondent about developments in her former life. The message contained a link to a news article with the headline, King Edmund and Queen Charlotte announce pregnancy. Cordelia stopped walking and read the article carefully. Charlotte was 4 months pregnant with what would be the heir to the throne, the child that Cordelia's body had never been able to provide. The article was respectful and joyous, focusing on the kingdom's excitement about the future rather than dwelling on past disappointments. To her surprise, Cordelia felt nothing but genuine happiness for both Edmund and Charlotte. The announcement represented the completion of everything they had sacrificed so much to achieve. The kingdom would have its heir, the succession would be secure, and both Edmund and Charlotte would have the family they deserved. She composed a brief message to Charlotte, not through official channels, but through Margaret, who maintained friendly contact with both women. Congratulations on your wonderful news. Wishing you both health and happiness. With warm regards, Cordelia. As she put her phone away, Cordelia realized that this news marked the final closure of her royal chapter. There would be no lingering questions about what might have been, no alternative futures to imagine. Edmund had moved forward successfully, and so had she. Back in her hotel room, she opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the International Education Consortium expressing serious interest in the Geneva position. As she wrote, she found herself thinking about the young woman who had married a prince 35 years ago, believing that love and duty would always align perfectly. That woman had been naive about many things, but she had been right about one crucial point. Service to others was indeed the most fulfilling way to live. The mistake had been assuming that such service could only take one form. The next morning, Cordelia flew back to Cambridge for what she now realized would be her final semester as a full-time university fellow. Professor Whitfield met her at the airport, eager to hear about her final weeks in Guatemala and her thoughts about the Geneva opportunity. "You're glowing," he observed as they drove through the English countryside. "The work clearly agrees with you." "It does," Cordelia confirmed. "I think I've finally figured out who I'm supposed to be in this phase of my life, which is someone who uses her experience to build bridges between academic theory and practical application, between different cultures and educational systems, between what the world is and what it could become." Professor Whitfield smiled. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work the world needs. When will you make your decision about Geneva?" "I think I've already made it," Cordelia said with growing certainty. "I just need to finalize some details." 2 weeks later, she found herself in Geneva for preliminary meetings with the consortium leadership. The city felt familiar from her royal years. She had attended numerous international conferences there, but approaching it as a potential base for independent work felt completely different. The consortium offices overlooked Lake Geneva, and during breaks between meetings, she stood at the windows watching sailboats navigate the calm waters. There was something poetic about the view, movement and stillness, tradition and innovation, all coexisting in beautiful harmony. Dr. Patricia Okafor, the consortium's founding director, joined her at the window during one of these contemplative moments. "This work isn't easy," Patricia said quietly. "We're asking you to take on some of the most complex educational challenges in the world, often in places where political instability makes long-term planning nearly impossible." "I understand," Cordelia replied. "But I've learned that meaningful work is rarely easy work. And I've also learned that I function best when I'm slightly in over my head. It forces me to grow in ways that comfort never could." Patricia studied her with the careful assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating leaders and their potential. "There's something I need to tell you. When your name was first suggested for this position, some board members expressed concerns about your lack of traditional credentials and your, shall we say, unconventional career path." Cordelia felt a familiar defensive instinct rise, then deliberately set it aside. She had learned that the best response to skepticism was demonstrated competence rather than justified indignation. "And what convinced them otherwise?" she asked calmly. "Your Guatemala project results," Patricia said with a smile. "Literacy rates in the provinces where you worked improved by 40% in less than a year, and the programs you established have become models for implementation in other countries. That kind of practical success speaks louder than any academic pedigree." That evening, Cordelia called Elena to offer her the deputy director position formally. Elena's enthusiastic acceptance felt like the final piece falling into place. Together, they would build something new and important, something that would make a tangible difference in the lives of children and families around the world. As she prepared for bed in her Geneva hotel room, Cordelia opened her laptop and began typing in her journal, a practice she had started during her transition from royal life. "Today I accepted the position that will define the next chapter of my career," she wrote. "5 years ago, I thought my life was ending when I left the palace. Now I understand that it was simply transforming into something I never could have imagined." She paused, thinking about the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. "I am no longer trying to be the queen I couldn't be or the academic I never trained to be. I am simply becoming the person I was always meant to become. Someone who serves others not because of the crown she wears or the title she holds, but because of the skills she has developed and the passion she has discovered." Outside her window, the lights of Geneva sparkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Somewhere in those lights were the offices where she would work, the colleagues she would collaborate with, the challenges she would tackle. Somewhere in the distance were the places where their work would make a difference, schools where children would learn to read, communities where knowledge would create opportunity, societies where education would build hope. For the first time in her life, Cordelia fell asleep, not thinking about what was expected of her the next day, but about what was possible. And her dreams were filled not with crowns or palaces or the ghosts of the life she had left behind, but with classrooms full of children learning to see the world as a place where anything, even the most dramatic personal transformation, was possible if you had the courage to rewrite your own story. The tears she shed that night were not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of profound gratitude for the unexpected gift of a second chance at becoming herself.